Ads ruining your favourite cycling podcast? Sick of shallow bike reviews? Escape Collective is different. We deliver the content you crave without the distractions. We're member supported, and that means ad-free podcasts, independent and honest reporting, and real conversations within a passionate community. It's a better way to experience cycling media. Join us at escapecollective.com/join.
Welcome back to the Performance Process Podcast. My name is Ronan, and as usual, I will be your host for this episode. In this week's podcast, we're continuing our conversation of late on bike fitting, and we're actually going to add a little balance into that conversation. So far, we've been focused on modern bike fitting and progressive saddle positions. In this week's episode, I am talking to Nathan Haas because during a recent ride alongside Nathan, I had noticed that his bike position was basically the polar opposite to what this podcast has discussed recently. His saddle position seems to be much further back than what we had discussed. He's got the nose tilted up, which is definitely the opposite of what we've discussed. And I was interested in why he had chosen that position, because I did know it was very different to what he had ridden when he was riding as a pro. So in this week's episode, we're discussing gravel bike fits with Nathan Haas. But before we jump into that, just a quick reminder that the Performance Process is an Escape Collective members podcast. So if you're not a member, you will get cut off about halfway through. If you'd rather not be cut off and you'd rather hear the entire episode, please head over to escapecollective.com/member, where you can sign up, get access to all of our written content, get access to all of our podcast content, and also get access to our Discord, where we have a Performance Process and Aero/time trial dedicated channels, where quite often our members continue the conversation kickstarted by these episodes. So without further ado, let's hear from Nathan. Nathan Haas, welcome to Performance Process. Thanks for joining us today. How's things?
I'm very well, thank you, man. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm excited to finally be included in something on Escape. I think this is the first thing I've been part of.
Oh wow, that's a glaring omission on our behalf. I mean, you were prominently featured at our old place, so I can't believe it's taken us this long to get you into the Escape, to become a friend of the collective.
See, I feel like maybe it was personal because I never actually took a membership.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you have, I'll leave it to our other members to let you know how they feel about that.
Well, I mean, the proof's going to be in the pudding, right? Like this could be absolutely terrible. Everyone goes, oh.
Yeah, well, no, I'm confident it won't be. We're effectively going to try to recreate a conversation that you and I had on the bike last week. Before we delve into that, though, 99.9% sure everybody listening will be aware of who Nathan Haas is, but just in case they are not, do you want to give us like a 10,000 foot view overview of your World Tour career and what you're doing with yourself now on the bike?
Well, I'll preface by saying I'm just a dude that loves bike riding and loves to study all things. And obviously, when you love something as much as we both love cycling, we both have our opinions and ideas. And that's what we're hopefully going to delve into today. But from a career point, I spent 10 years in the World Tour smashing about, helping, or at least trying to help guys win big races, and won a few myself. And then the end of 2021, I changed discipline into gravel, and it's been really fun ever since. This is my third year doing it. Starting to feel old for sure. Yeah, it's been really fun to be part of a sport that I would say when I joined was just, I wouldn't say it was in its infancy, but it was still very much in its youth. And I think it's slowly maturing in front of our eyes, and we're learning a lot about it as we go.
Well, you were quite modest there, so I will ream off your results here from Pro Cycling Stats because you haven't. You have twice won Japan Cup, you've won Tour Britain overall, Herald Sun Tour, a stage of Tour Oman, a stage of Vuelta a Burgos, and a stage of the Herald Sun Tour. So a heralded career. Can I use that pun given the last result there?
Yeah, I mean, I love a good pun, Ronan. For me, the personal victories were always, great, and things that I chased a lot, but I still hold dearest the two monuments that we won alongside Dan Martin, Liège and Lombardia. I think it was always quite obvious to me that I was a good cyclist, and, I could beat all of the best guys, Sagan, Bling, Van Avermaet, just not all at the same time. I got a lot of seconds and thirds and fourths to those guys. And for me, the real sweet sauce of cycling was always, chasing the biggest victories you can. I took a lot of pride in working for the best sprinters in the world, best punchy rollers, and also Grand Tour ride. For me, the real highlights personally of my career were, strangely enough, not the victories I took myself, but always the ones in assistance to the greatest.
I can relate to that, but mostly because I never really had any victories. So it was only my teammates' victories that I could take pride in. Anyway, the thing we're here to discuss today is bike positioning, bike fit, and gravel. Before we delve into that, I'm going to skip to the end of that conversation we had last week when I asked you, Nathan, how do you know all this stuff? And you enlightened me as to what you're studying at the moment.
Yeah, I said before I like to learn. Like to say before anything on the podcast is I don't try to pretend to be an expert. I actually strive to be a generalist. I think it's somewhat of a forgotten path, is that, people that can know a lot about one thing, you are an expert for sure, but you can be lost in analysis paralysis in some regards. And I actually have a lot more respect for my sort of academic mentors, people that are attempting to be general in what they know and know quite a lot about a lot of things, not necessarily everything about one thing. I've been studying for the last 5 years a Bachelor of Science in Health Sciences, and in the past, or also an arts degree in Philosophy and Political Science. So I've got an up-and-coming, well-rounded education, and my career path, I'm working towards hopefully becoming an osteopath in the future with a master's degree. For what has really taken my interest over a decade, I would say, is actually the science of the human body, but more specifically looking at it from a neurological perspective, a structural perspective, and actually seeing how the body responds to certain inputs and also impacts, so to speak. So for me, I think, maybe perhaps it's the archetype of the wounded healer, is that, I had a lot of injuries and problems in cycling, as does every athlete. But when I was, trying to treat things more with, a purely evidence-based medicine approach, I found that everything tended to be somewhat of a Band-Aid. When you spoke to your sports doctor, I'm having these lung problems, they'll give you an inhaler. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm having these back problems. Here's some non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs. I'm having this issue. Let's treat that with an antacid. At very best, you maybe had some respite from the issue. But where I really found the sweet sauce lay was actually looking at things more holistically, speaking with different types of therapies and experiencing those, and actually finding that there's other things that can actually look at the cause and the root of the problem as opposed to trying to fix the symptom. And I know today that we are talking about bike fit, and obviously bike fit is trying to take three main things into account. One is power, which is an output, very 10,000 foot view of what the body is able to do when we push our pedals down, and we see power, which is cadence times torque. We look at it from a physics standpoint. The second is aerodynamics. We're trying to have a position that we can have as much power output as possible with a smallest drag or frontal area, however we want to describe it. And then the third is that position rideable? So these are the three things that we're always trying to take into account. And we got speaking at the launch of the Colnago G4X. Ronan, for the listeners, was at the launch with Colnago. And mostly a quick compliment to you. We were speaking the Colnago directors, and they were all saying that Ronan on this earth is their favorite tech writer and tech analysis. They really love the way that you think and approach things, especially because you're a fantastic cyclist yourself, and that you can actually feel the differences, not just looking at raw data. So firstly, there's a compliment for you. But you were...
I assume all other websites are geo-blocked for those people. So anyway, moving on.
They only speak Italian anyway. They're not. And we got speaking a little bit on my thoughts on bike position, which I think maybe shocked you, is that I was using pretty different language to everyone else.
Yeah. I mean, like when I eventually figured out that you're studying to become an osteopath, it all just made sense because you were referring to things that I myself would often talk about, but I wouldn't know the specific terminology. I'm not saying it shocked me that you knew the terminology. It's just that you were using that terminology. I think was maybe refreshing is a better way to put it.
Well, hope we can refresh some other listeners by delving in.
Yes, I mean that conversation started because we were riding side by side on that Colnago gravel bike. I said to you, I want to ask you about your gravel position because it is very different to the bikes that I had seen you set up in when you're riding road in the World Tour. And yeah, basically discuss or explain to me, please, why.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it's best to start off by just if you describe what you saw.
So what I saw was a saddle that was slammed all the way back as far as possible on the seat post. If I remember correctly, you had a setback seat post, meaning that, that's even further back. You also had the saddle angle, I would say, angled steeply upwards, positive angle. And yeah, that was because when I compared that to your road bike position, I mean, you weren't slammed all the way forward, but you were sort of in a middle position, if I remember correctly, and your saddle was pretty much level. And I was keen to figure out, or keen to hear if that was using bike fit to overcome other issues, as you've just sort of alluded to, or was that using bike fit to perform better on gravel?
So it's both. It's both. My road setback was always 70 mil behind the bottom bracket. Depending on which saddle I had, sometimes it would be anywhere between 70 and 75 mil behind the bottom bracket. Obviously, on a time trial bike, I was right up onto the limit of 50. But to account for that, the saddle also went up. And on the TT bike, I used to run 165 mil cranks. I think I was one of the early adopters to.
You must have been.
To using a shorter crank. It was a slow creep down. I moved to 170s when that was the smallest the team would happily give you. And then as people started to accept the science or different arguments for science, the 165 became available and I preferred that. But yeah, my road position, I would say, was pretty much classic for what era I was in. If we look at the 90s era, everything was slammed back, dropped as far front down on the handlebar as possible. But by the time I was racing, I would say I had a very classic road position, nothing too extreme. But when I moved across to gravel, I started to realize that the discipline actually has slightly different needs. If you look at the physics or the physical demands of gravel, I've always felt as though on the road bike, having equal weight distribution is king, right? You're kind of always looking to have that like center line. So if we sort of pointed just on this pen here, this is where you would sit at center line. This would be forward of center line, and this would be behind the center line. And on the road bike, when you're cornering, most of the time, sitting in center line is exactly what the bike is designed to actually take the weight evenly on the front and rear wheel to make that corner.
For the benefits of the listeners who can't see us, would that be like bottom bracket on a road bike, or where would that be in a road bike?
I think everyone is behind the bottom bracket. I think there's more muscular mass behind the bottom bracket. I think no matter how you paint it, unless perhaps you're Geraint Thomas, but it's more of a feeling. It's like car drivers use this terminology quite well, is when they're actually in the center point of their car, the car is neither tipped forward or tipped back. It's right sort of on that central point. And that's where most people would have their road bike position. But I started to realize that traction on the rear wheel is actually one of the biggest rate limiting factors in both going through corners and also climbing and actually keeping traction on that rear wheel. So one of my first intuitive things to do was to actually see how far I could get back without affecting a few other positional issues. One of those being, if you just slide the seat back, because the seat post is actually on an angle, if you just slide the seat back, you're actually also effectively making your leg length to crank longer. So you're actually making your leg length longer, which is not necessarily a good thing, right? Because most of us have, a limit on what we can actually keep our sacrum on the bike without rocking. So to compensate for that, I also lowered my seat about 1 centimeter from my road position. So my effective leg length actually remained the same, but now I'm actually sitting further behind the bottom bracket with more weight on the rear wheel. This allows for a few things. Is when you're climbing, your front wheel is almost passive on a gravel bike. And a lot of the time what you're actually trying to do is you're actually trying to minimize compressions from anything coming. So that could be a hole, a root, a rock, or a bump. Anytime you hit one of those, that's actually sending force through the bike and pushing you backwards, which can create, firstly, a traction issue on the back wheel. But secondly, it's also just making it harder because your whole body is now having to absorb not one bump, but 2 bumps because it goes from the front wheel to the back wheel. So if you have more weight on your back wheel as you're climbing, it's already easier for you to do a slight movement to actually lift that front wheel off the ground. So you've also unweighted the front wheel, created more traction, and you've eliminated one of the compressions. So the front wheel is actually moving quite a lot. And as anyone that's done a little bit of gravel riding knows, if you marry yourself to too much focus on one line when you're climbing, that's often when you actually come to a moment where you have to unclip because maybe you've slipped a little bit or maybe your weight's not perfect and you become offline. If your front wheel is a little bit more passive, it's like watching a cyclocross rider ride through sand. They're actually quite relaxed through the shoulders and they're actually letting their bike do the driving. But the one thing that they're focused on is creating drive and force from the rear wheel. So that's exactly the same case for gravel riding. But one issue that comes with coming back is that you're actually, like if this was your position, and again, for sorry listeners not watching, if you come further back, it's actually closing your hip angle as well, which means your chest is being compressed, your diaphragm is no longer able to actually slide up and down as you're breathing, and your shoulders are rolling forward, which means that you're no longer breathing into essentially your lower back and you're just shallow breathing into your chest, which means 1, you're getting less oxygen, but 2, you're actually creating a sympathetic nervous system reaction. And a sympathetic nervous system reaction is a fight or flight, and a parasympathetic system reaction is basically we're all good. Everything is great. So if we're short breathing, we also now have to think about how do we open up the chest. The simple answer is bring the handlebars up higher. And there's a secondary reason to why I think that we need to bring our handlebars higher on the gravel bike is that anytime that we're doing a descent that's steep on the gravel bike, and keep in mind that gravel goes down much steeper descents than you ever could possibly do on the road. We're going down drops, which means if you have your hands on the hoods, I would actually say that this is not the most stable way to ride your bike technically downhill. So I would spend 100% of my time descending anything technical is always on the drops. Now, if we have our drops where our position was on the road, we're actually going to be so far tipped forward that we're actually just going to lose control of the bike. And it also drives you into a non-neutral position. It actually puts you into a forward-leaning position, which means that everything is all of a sudden starting to feel a little bit frantic on the front. So the hip angle that I've actually tried to achieve from, if we call it from my road position, is that the hip angle that I had when I was on the tops of my bars, so holding the hoods, that's the hip angle that I try to achieve when I'm on the drops, because I'm going to be spending almost my entire day in a gravel race on the drops. Okay. By bringing the front end up to allow for that, that's also now accounted for the fact that my hip angle at the back has closed. So my hip angle is now open. I'm now riding in a position that's very comfortable in the drops, that I can now technically go down hills better, and I can actually push further against my bike because it's actually sitting closer to me. So my general rule, if I'm ever telling somebody to change their bike position on the gravel bike, is bring your handlebars up a centimeter. I've gone 2, but bring your handlebars up a centimeter, put your saddle down a centimeter, and push it back 5 to 7 mils. And that's sort of like the basic layman's way of doing it. And obviously everybody's physiology is different. So it's a different way to kind of look at each person if you were to get specific. But just as a general rule, I think that's quite an easy way for someone to all of a sudden set up their bike, that they're going to be climbing better, and they're also going to be riding technically a lot safer, which is that's really the goal, is you always want to achieve safety on a bike, because I believe that speed comes from feeling safe. Because if you feel like something's dangerous, you're going to be more on the brakes.
Yes.
You find a position that feels safer, the speed kind of comes accidentally.
And I mean, what you're saying there sounds to me like this is something, that's a sort of position that you would recommend for male or female.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, like I think there are obviously going to be differences specifically around saddle position, I think. But what you're talking about here so far is, I'm not hearing from you that this is a comfort choice or really a power production choice. This is more a choice around control and stability and traction on gravel surfaces. Is that fair to say?
I would say that that's the first consideration. Okay. And those other considerations also fall into this. For me, I personally disagree with this sort of new trend of people sliding forward on the bike in general. So we can talk about road positions here. My first grievance with that bike position is that a lot of people feel as if they can produce more power in that position, but it's a very quad dominant way of pedaling. The issue with quads is that it's a muscle type that requires a lot of glycogen. They're extremely glycolytic. So, when we set someone up on an indoor trainer or even in the velodrome, if we're testing aerodynamic positions and power output, trying to find like a nice middle ground. The thing is, because we have so much glycogen when we're fresh and we're jumping on a bike for a bike fit, the power is obviously going to be quite high and everyone's going to feel quite punchy. But to me, I believe that this is actually like a false state of mind, or it's a false positive, because the reality is in cycling, it's not won in the first 90 minutes. It's really about who's anti-fragile, who can actually sustain themselves and create a glycolytic effort at the end of 5 or 6 hours.
It's that durability buzzword, isn't it?
Yeah, I like the word durability, but I also like the concept of anti-fragile. Like what's the opposite of strength?
Fragile.
I think fragile. And for me, it's like we want to stop being fragile. We don't want to have any weak points in our race. So, durability works there also.
Just to delve into that for a second, the fragility you think is, am I correct in thinking it's that forward position might feel great in a test. You might actually produce more power, but it's fragile because what you're saying, you quicker deplete the glycogen levels in the quads, and as such you then maybe start to fatigue in a way that means that position isn't as functional or isn't as strong after 5 hours, rather than it being fragile in terms of you actually get injured or something. Is it? Am I hearing you right?
Yeah. This is more about an energy system. I don't think there's necessarily any risk on injury. I definitely think it's sort of asking what's left at the end of the day if the quads are gone. And this is where biomechanics kind of come into the argument here, is that if you're training every day on that forward position and you're doing efforts and everything starts to feel fantastic, you're going to probably believe that that position is what I should be racing on. But very rarely in training, we're doing an average of 300, 320 watts and then needing to perform, 6 watts per kilo, or in the World Tour case now, sometimes 8 watts per kilo for 10 minutes. So if you're needing to use your quads for those first 4 hours, and then you go to stand up, people are going to say, maybe my fitness isn't there, or maybe I need to do more work. I wasn't quite on that day. But the reality is, if you're sitting really far forward, you can't use your glutes at the same time as your hamstring. That's not a firing pattern. You actually need to be in a different position for your body to actually use that weight of being over the pedal, as opposed to like literally in front of the pedal. So if you're sitting in a front position where you're really far forward, one of the biggest rate limiting factors in human flexibility is actually ankle dorsiflexion. So that's your ankle's ability to actually flex when you're over the front of it. Everybody has a natural limit. And also what tends to happen in cyclists as they fatigue is that flexibility actually becomes more limited and that ligament won't pass forward. So if you're not able to actually drive with your foot essentially flat, you can't use one of the basic movement patterns in the human body, which is called the gait, the walking gait. And the walking gait is what we use naturally every single day. And that's when we are walking forward, we lift our leg, and then that leg actually sways outwards. So everyone thinks that we walk like this, in a frontal plane, but actually the way we're walking is we're lifting and we're falling forward. We're lifting and we're falling forward. We're lifting and we're falling forward, but outward.
And again, outward, yeah.
When we're seated on the bike, we're actually, essentially, we're kind of walking backwards, because when we're seated on the bike, the body is moving on this like vertical plane, this frontal plane. But when we're out of the saddle, that's actually where we start to see people dancing on the bike, is the people that are actually using that walking gait, and they're falling onto the pedal and then pushing through, falling and pushing through. And that's helping, that's letting gravity actually help us. But to bring it back to the foot position, if we're so far forward on the bike, the natural thing for us to do is we actually tilt our foot forward. So we almost go into like a ballet dancer's position. And if you have a look at any side-on picture of anybody sitting in a more forward position, it's like they're doing ballet on the bike. It's the wrong kind of dancing. It's doing these circles.
And is that having a knock-on effect on the other muscles further up the chain, and that they're always engaged then?
It's not necessarily that they're always engaged. It's that they can't be engaged in a shortened state. So a really good way for people to kind of test this, if they wanted to feel it for themselves, because I think sometimes the best form of teaching is actually giving somebody a practical way to feel this. If anybody has a gym ball at home, like the type that you sit on and you do yoga, put your foot flat on the ball, standing over it, and push down. You can push like 100 times. It not only feels easy, but it feels very powerful. That's because you're using core driving muscles, which is your glute med and your glute max, and your hamstrings are all firing in sync together, making use of our walking gait, which again is one of our like fundamental movement patterns. So we're standing over the ball like that. Now all of a sudden go up onto your toe and try to push. You're only using the muscles on the front of your shin and your core.
Yeah. I can test it just sitting here in the office chair. Yeah, I can get a sense for it.
Yeah, so we're not actually using some of our like basic fundamental human movement patterns anymore on the bike. This doesn't really matter if it's less than 2 hours, because we have so much glycolytic reserve. But as soon as that's depleted, the issue is for these riders is that they can no longer actually get into a position where they can start to use their other muscle groups, because you can't access those together. You can fire your glute gently in part of that movement pattern. You can slightly use your hamstring on the point from the pedal stroke, which is like 6 to 8. But the difference is that they're not actually working in a movement chain or a pattern. It's like using a gym equipment that's on rails, as opposed to lifting free weights, which is where we're actually using movement patterns and lines that actually move across the body. All of a sudden we're isolating. And what happens when we isolate, it's like having a battery in a TV remote that's full versus adding a battery that's empty. This full battery will actually deplete faster than if it had 2 half-filled batteries, because they will actually fatigue together. So the issue that I see with these positions is that they're actually isolating muscle groups, depleting them really fast, as opposed to isolating no muscle groups, or maybe
balancing.
Yeah, maybe using some at a higher extent at different parts of the race. When the race is on, you're definitely going to be using a little bit more quad. But all of a sudden, when the race is going easier and you're using other groups, you're actually balancing that energy demand across different groups.
Okay, folks, that's all you get if you're not an Escape Collective member. As we mentioned at the start, head over to escapecollective.com/member to become a member today and get access to this entire podcast, and not have to have me rudely interrupt you again in future. Go on. You want to. You want to hear the full episode. You want to be a member. Head on over. Do the thing. Sign up for a month. Sign up for a year. Whatever you prefer. And you will get these podcasts in their entirety heading forward. Oh, and if you're already a member and you're hearing this, you should not be. So check out your email from Escape Collective when you signed up for details on how to access the full episodes, or if you're still having issues, feel free to get in contact with one of us through the website. Thank you.